My name is MT Dávila. I'm Associate Professor of Christian Ethics at Andover-Newton Theological School. Today, I'd like to talk to you about the challenges of race and gender within the church and in society in light of human dignity, and I've titled my comments, Dignity in Difference. It really is a huge question or task to address both race and gender in a 30-minute conversation, but what I'm hoping we can do in this time and in the question and answer period later, and if you wish to engage me and others after that, is to look specifically at resources from Catholic social teaching on these two issues to get a broad sense of how to speak about them in the context of Catholic social teaching, but also in the context of larger society and things that events that we are experiencing both in the United States but also globally in April of 2018. Recording this on the day after we remember and commemorated the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. So that significance and symbolism is not lost to me on our conversation. So I hope you see it in this context. So, human dignity in Catholic social teaching is the principal or highest concept that we get from this 100-year plus documentary history from teachings from the church about what it means to be a disciple in community, in society, in the political structures, in the political body. And within that, every single human being, as this image presents, has an inherent value and worth that is God-given, that is primary, and that cannot be taken away. So in light of that, political structures and policies must be affirmed in the same way. Human dignity in Catholic social teaching has been framed throughout, like I said, throughout the 100+ years of this documentary history, and there are some specific passages that give light to this teaching. St. John Paul II is most responsible for giving to us a really specific way of framing it and utilizing it in all his teachings. From Centesimus Annus we get, human persons are willed by God, they are imprinted with God's image, their dignity does not come from the work they do, but from the persons they are. Again, this is God-given and not something that any political system, any sorts of borders, or any vision of racial superiority can erase. St. John the 23rd in Mater et Magistra tells us individual human beings are the foundation, the cause, and the end of every social institution. And from that moment on, we're going to get in the church the sense of integral development or integral human ecology. That is, that all of the spectrum of dimensions of human activity in the world have to be accompanied or have to be judged by the criteria of human dignity. Regardless of how insignificant they may be or how intimate they may be within the family or larger structures in the community. Human dignity is at the center of every social institution. Further on, we get in the United States Catholic bishops in their pastoral letter, Economic Justice for All, tell us specifically to economic systems that the basis for all that the church believes about the moral dimension of economic life is its vision of the transcendent worth, the sacredness of human beings. The dignity of the human person realized in community with others is the criterion against which all aspects of economic life must be measured. So these are just some of the highlights of Catholic social teaching on human dignity. There's so many more if you wish to explore this. But what it's telling us is that this is the primary value, the primary criterion by which we are to judge all our interactions and all structures and policies and practices in our community. And we'll get back to that sense of how important practices and traditions are, because sometimes we may consider that our institutions try to uphold equality, that our institutions try to uphold human dignity, but then we see that in reality, in practice, they're not doing so. In reality and in practice, they are excluding certain groups, or they are doing outright violence to certain groups. So alternately, Catholic social teaching also tells us how human dignity is challenged, how sin and different expressions of sin make us to do damage to each other in society, both interpersonally, of course, that's personal sin, but also structurally, that we can build up structures, we can support systems that in essence are an affront to human dignity. In the Catechism of the Catholic Church, we hear there exists also sinful inequalities that affect millions of men and women. These are in open contradiction of the gospel. Their equal dignity as persons demands that we strive for fairer and more humane conditions. Excessive economic and social disparity between individuals and peoples of the one human race is a source of scandal and militates against social justice, equity, human dignity, as well as social and international peace. And we'll come back to that notion of peace as being one of the principles that when we look at race and gender, when there is no peace, those racial violence and gender violence are one of the expressions of the lack of peace that we experience more severely and more immediately. And then from Gaudium et Spes and the Second Vatican Council of the Constitution of the Church in the Modern World, we see whatever insults human dignity, such as subhuman living conditions, arbitrary imprisonment, deportation, slavery, prostitution, the selling of women and children, as well as disgraceful working conditions where men are treated as mere tools for profit, rather than as free and responsible persons. All these things and others of their life are infamies indeed. They poison human society, but they do more harm to those who practice them than those who suffer from the injury. So there you see a catalog of the ways in which human dignity can be affronted. Anything from subhuman living conditions, which is certainly something like homelessness or lack of access to clean water, or lack of access to employment, slavery, and we'll talk about modern slavery in a moment, prostitution, affronts to women, domestic violence, human trafficking. All of these are affronts to human dignity, whether in great forms or in minor forms. And so there's degrees within each of these that can be examined in the spaces that we live in and that we minister in. So these are just some images to speak about how we see affronts to human dignity, specifically because of race and because of gender today. So the first image on social exclusion, it's talking about three dimensions in which life in society is greatly impacted when we are excluded. So quality of life, health and well-being, living environment, crime, harm, and criminalization. For those of you that may be from the context of the United States, when you look at living environment and you look at, we're going to touch on this a little later, the question of racial environmental injustice, that in fact in the U.S. and globally, Black and brown communities, not just poorer communities, but Black and brown communities specifically, are ones that suffer the impact of environmental degradation first, that it gets attended less quickly. And we can see that, for example, in the case of Flint, Michigan, where the water was tainted, and the community, which is mainly made of Black and brown families and also very poor families that include poor white families, have had to deal with unclean, tainted water, tainted with lead, that has impacted the well-being of their children. On the resources side, social exclusion brings in lack of material and economic resources, access to public and private services, social resources, and education and skills. So for both women and Black and brown communities, or racially other communities from the dominant groups, are excluded from educational and employment opportunities, from political opportunities, and access to public services and institutions. With respect to participation, again, these groups are either not given the right to vote, to make decisions for their own destiny, and the shaping of their own communities. Decisions are made for them in ways that really impact their well-being and their access. And also, with respect to cultural participation, they are asked to integrate to a dominant model of cultural belonging and expressions, whether in the public sphere or in the private sphere as well. On the gender exclusion side, there's the next image of gender wage gap is just for you to see, especially in the US, what wage discrimination looks like, where you have the male, that for every dollar that a male earns, different people, different images of women, or different expressions of different women are going to earn differently from African, the $1 that the male earns, sometimes significantly less if these women are either African American or Latino in the United States. Globally, the next image on the bottom left speaks about 1 in 3 women worldwide subject to violence over the course of their lives, which is a pretty standard statistic. It's one that has been recognized globally, and violence here is described broadly, but it can range from anything from feminicide, that is the particular targeting of women and girls for the fact that they're women and girls, to be killed, dismembered, or abducted, etc., or systemically raped or done violence to, not as a sexual crime, but as a gender crime. So that is as a crime because they specifically target these persons as women. Women will suffer an inordinate amount of violence from war that is targeted at them by virtue of being women and by virtue of being the ones that are responsible often for the household, and therefore when there are situations of war, attacking women and destroying the dignity of women is one way in which the opponent in a situation of war will try to gain advantage over their people that they're trying to attack. And we, of course, have a legacy of slavery. That's the next image. A legacy of slavery in the United States and globally. But we do have numbers of modern-day slavery which do surpass the numbers of enslaved peoples in colonial U.S. and in the Americas. We have children and women being trafficked, and often these are people who are racially and in terms of gender, minorities in their context. So they are made more vulnerable. They are more vulnerable for being trafficked, and race has a lot to do with where these bodies come from and where these slaves come from. And both Pope Benedict and Pope Francis have been very vocal about the church playing a role in ending modern-day slavery. So this is something that we see as deep affronts to human dignity today. In order to understand the kinds of affront to human dignity that racial and gender violence play, it's important to have a working knowledge of what structural sin is. And Catholic social teaching doesn't necessarily speak about structural sin as its own element. There is a tradition within Catholicism that wants sin to be, or that tries to uphold that sin is the personal decision of every person, so that structures don't necessarily lead us to sin. We follow these structures, and then we as individuals fall into sin. other dimensions of Catholic life, theologians, etc., liberation theology and other theologies talk about structural sin. And that is, I'm defining that as that in addition to personal sin, structural sin concerns the institutions and traditions that either by their very nature, such as slavery, or in the practices they sustain or encourage, such as unfettered consumption, present an affront to the dignity of the human family and of particularly vulnerable institutions or persons within that the human family. So we are now talking about practices, structures, policies, laws in our society that by their very nature are exclusionary and enact violence on particular groups, or impose violence, impose lesser conditions on particular groups. So for example, carving out areas where a particular group of people cannot live, or in not attending to the sanitation needs of a large swath of the population, or not attending to how education, for example, might be quite disparate from one group to another. One community may have a very good education, whereas a system, whereas another community will have a much poorer education system. One place where this, just an example that comes to mind, is from a student of mine who wrote a report on his home country, where he says private schools give a much superior education to those who can afford it and those who can pay for it. And usually these are Catholic schools in that country. Then public schools, where the assignments for teaching are given because of political favors, and they're not really, public schools are not attended financially by the government. The teachers are not held up to standards. Sometimes teachers are absent for days at a time. And because it's a political assignment to be a teacher, and it's a political favor, children end up suffering. They show up to school, but they don't get an education. So this is a way in which there is in that country an educational differential that is impacting different groups of people because of their ability to pay for schooling, and often that is related to ethnic group or racial group. So let's look specifically at racism as a structural sin, as a social evil in which we participate both socially but also personally. We get from the compendium of the social doctrine of the Church, quote, "Despite the widespread aspiration to build an authentic international community, the unity of the human family has not yet become a reality. This is due to obstacles originating in materialistic and nationalistic ideologies that contradict the values of the person integrally, considered in all their various dimensions, material and spiritual, individual and community. In particular, any theory or form whatsoever of racism and racial discrimination is morally unacceptable." So types of discrimination and racial violence that we can see, or racial oppression that we can see, are discrimination in education and employment. We've already seen that, or I've already covered some of that. Violence to particular communities. So when a particular community is targeted, either through political or any other form of violence, that is unacceptable as a sign of racial structural sin and violence. Environmental racism, which I covered, so understanding that certain communities that typically are Black, brown, and poor are receiving the initial impact and the greatest impact from environmental degradation. Unequal and disproportionately punitive treatment in the criminal justice system. So when we have summary killing of unarmed Black men in the United States by the police, or overly punitive sentences being handed out to Black and brown men, especially women, increasingly in the U.S. Court system for the same crimes as white men and women, that inequality and disproportionate assignment of sentencing is an occasion of racial injustice. Immigration and settlement policies biased against particular groups or countries. So when we have an immigration policy that is applied with discrimination, particularly against certain groups, so that the same policy applies differently depending on where you come from, and often depending on the color of your skin or your ethnicity, that is also another case of racial injustice. With respect to gender violence and exclusion, the Catechism of the Catholic Church tells us that every form of social or cultural discrimination in fundamental personal rights on the grounds of sex, race, color, social conditions, language, or religion must be curbed and eradicated as incompatible with God's design. So issues such as unequal pay that we observed in the image in a few slides before, intimate partner violence, human trafficking, but the trafficking of women for sexual slavery and other kinds of slavery, forced labor and forced slavery, forced marriage in communities where that continues to happen, female genital mutilation, again, in communities where that continues to happen, exclusions in educational and employment opportunities. So those are dimensions in which women, by virtue of being women, are subjected to a different level of opportunities, life prospects, well-being, physical, mental, and spiritual integrity. So that difference in treatment, but also a greater impact of violence, is considered gender exclusion and gender violence, and it is, as the Catechism states, incompatible with God's design. Catholic social teaching offers us a whole host of resources to begin to speak to these issues. So, for example, we began the presentation speaking about the primacy of human dignity in the principles of Catholic social teaching, as well as other principles, but really all of them stemming from the primacy of human dignity. That is that, as I mentioned earlier, that bodily, mental, and spiritual integrity of the human being, personally and in community, so and in her or his social dimensions, is the first and foremost goal of the economy, of political structures, and mediating structures in civil society. Other principles of Catholic social teaching that help us to speak to what we should do as people of faith, and especially as communities of faith and our churches, include the option for the poor. That is, church, imitating Christ asks that we stand in solidarity with the most vulnerable members of our society. That is, those members of our society that are most excluded, most on the margins, who receive the impact, a negative impact from our policies, that as a church we ought to consider our place with them. Pope Francis has made it a point that we ought to smell like sheep, that those who minister to God's church ought to smell like sheep. That is, we ought to be outside the doors of the church, outside the doors of the sanctuary, and in the streets with those who are most vulnerable. Often these will be Black and Brown communities and communities of the excluded minorities that include members of the transgender community, women, and lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender youth especially, who are often at risk of violence targeted directly at them by virtue of being women or transgender or gay, but also at risk of homelessness because of exclusionary housing policies, etc. Another principle of Catholic social teaching that might be helpful is the integrity of creation, protecting the environment and those most impacted by the ravages of climate change. In Laudato Si', Pope Francis speaks to women in particular as and indigenous communities and communities in the Southern Hemisphere as those most directly impacted by climate change. And therefore, we must attend to that dimension of the integrity of creation and caring for creation. Peace and disarmament, I mentioned earlier that, in fact, wherever there is conflict, armed conflict in the world, women and racial minorities, ethnic minorities, are going to be the most directly impacted. Violence against women as a weapon of war is outlawed, of course, by the United Nations and globally understood to be a crime of war, but continues to be a method of war and conflict that is used globally. Another principle, dignity of labor, would inform us that just wages, so equal pay for equal work, the protection of workers, business enterprises, to understand that business enterprises are for the benefit of workers and the community, not for profit, would have us look specifically at how our labor practices and policies impact the life of women. If a woman, John Paul II in Laborem Exercens talked about when a head of household or a woman has to take on more than one job to keep a home and food for their family and feed their family, then that is a working condition that does not uphold the dignity of that worker and of their person and their family, which is the next principle I would like to mention, upholding the family and the centrality of family in Catholic social teaching, looking out for the integrity of all members of the family, especially women and children, when social conditions such as war, migration, famine, or policies threaten their well-being. Another resource from Catholic social teaching is the acknowledgement of the important role of women in the Church that we received this from St. John Paul II to Benedict XVI and now Pope Francis, being really clear that without women, the Church would not be the Church of God. Without their leadership, without their contributions, it would not be the Church that Christ instituted. And therefore, we must find ways that both within Church, within our institutions, our schools, our hospitals, and other institutions that are funded and grounded in Church teaching, uphold the dignity of women in all its dimensions, but especially when it comes to wages, when it comes to possibilities for participation and advancing in a profession. Finally, strong support for human rights, the rights of migrants, the protection of youth and children, and integral human development are other principles and knowledge that we receive from Catholic social teaching that will help us address racial and gender violence and oppression. Just want to close with identifying some tensions that remain. That is, these are tensions that Catholic social teaching might really give us some great principles, but when we come into putting them into practice, there might be some conflict in how we do so and in understanding our possibilities in doing so. So, for example, identifying the role of advocacy and nonviolent resistance and civil disobedience in social transformation for greater equality and justice. Catholic social teaching advocates for the political process to be where Christians affect transformation in the world. But there are moments in which advocacy and community organizing, nonviolent resistance is necessary when structural evil is such that it really attacks and affronts human dignity of some groups. And that tension has always existed. Churches, especially in the U.S., which is my context, have a hard time getting involved in activism, marches, the kinds of transformation or demands for transformation that we are seeing more recently. And so we need to have robust discussions about how we deal with that in our churches. Upholding the dignity of women within the Church when considering the question of the exclusion of holy orders. So a male priesthood presents for some women and for some communities a real challenge because they see that the Church, they interpret that as the Church not upholding the full dignity of women. And again, it's an issue that concerns many, and that especially women who feel a strong call to the priesthood, but cannot entertain moving into that. Respecting the role of civil society in protecting human dignity as it implements policies contrary to Catholic teaching on gender and sexuality. So when communities, political bodies, governments move to upholding, say, same-sex marriage, the rights of transgender persons, etc., the church needs to consider which principle it's going to privilege. Is it, say, the teaching on marriage, or is it protecting human dignity of communities that are typically more vulnerable? These are in tension, and we as leaders in the church, people who hope to minister in the church, need to look at this tension and examine it carefully, on how it operates in our context, and what would be the most faithful ways of resolving that tension. Balancing the role of the state and protection of its borders while defending the rights of all people to seek a life free of persecution with greater dignity for self and family. That is a question that globally it is supremely important, and that is the role of the state in protecting its borders vis-a-vis the rights of migrants, which the Catholic Church upholds, to move across borders in search of greater dignity and to flee persecution and violence. Again, a tension that churches must examine and speak publicly, not just about its own principles, but about how it's trying to answer and advocate for greater dignity for families, especially families of migrants. So I hope this very brief account of these two issues in light of human dignity and Catholic social teaching just gives you some more language, raises some important questions for you, and prepares you to search further and learn further on these issues. Thank you.